In the vast corpus of Tolkien's legendarium, the maritime empire of Numenor stands out as the greatest civilization ever built by the race of men. Numenor was a nation built on the great deeds of humans who understood the gift of their race, mortality. Yet as generations passed, the Númenóreans became too proud of their accomplishments, their hubris leading them to envy what the elves had, and they did not: eternal life. The Númenóreans forgot the importance of the gift of men, became resentful of it, and rebelled against their god, an act which led to their doom. The rise and fall of Numenor is a cautionary tale of the second fall of man, for it was the pride of man that led its most prosperous civilization to its downfall. At the end of the First Age, the War of Wrath saw the host of the Valar triumphant over the Dark Lord Morgoth. The majority of his Balrogs were destroyed, uncounted legions of orcs perished, and the surviving Men of Darkness fled east. However, this victory was costly. The fury of the war had broken most of the north and western parts of Beleriand, while the sea formed large chasms and split the land with new rivers as valleys were flooded. In the wake of this destruction, Eonwë summoned the elves of Beleriand, telling them they could depart Middle-earth for Valinor. Many sailed to Tol Eressëa, while others stayed in Middle-earth. During the war, the race of man had been divided. The three houses of the Edain, alone of the kindreds of men, fought for the Valar, whereas all other humans fought for Morgoth. After the war, the Valar offered the Edain a reward for their faithfulness, and the Edain asked for two things: peace and long life. Peace was readily granted, but long life more hesitantly, and only after Manwë consulted Eru and received Eru's blessing. To give the Edain peace, a large island was created for their dwelling. It was neither part of Middle-earth nor Valinor. It was raised by Ossi out of the depths of the Great Sea, established by Auli and enriched by Yavanna. The Eldar came to this island bearing flowers and fountains from Tol Eressëa. The land was shaped like a five-pointed star. The Valar called it Andor, meaning the land of the gift. The Edain called it Elena, meaning starwards, or Anaduni in Westernesse. The Sindar called it Numenor. The five peninsular promontories of Numenor were called Orostar, Hiarostar, Andustar, Hianustar, and Forostar, and each of them had its own unique geological features. The northern promontory of Forostar was a mountainous and rocky land with high cliffs, moors, and woodlands of larch and fir. On its northern tip were North Cape and Sorrentil, where eagles resided in nearby hills. It was here where Tar-Meneldur built a tower in the northernmost part of Numenor, where the sky was clearest to see the stars. On the southern tip of Forostar was the city of Ondosto, where there may have been great stone quarries. The western promontory of Andustar was a land of fertile terrain, with forests of firs, 3 bays on its western shores, and the Bay of Andúnië on its north. Built within the bay was the titular port city Andúnië, whose lords would become the future ancestors of the kingdoms in exile. Tar-Minestir built a high tower on Oromet, a hill near Andúnië, so he could try to glimpse upon Tol Eressëa. The southwestern promontory was Hianustar, which was also very fertile and ideal for farming and the cultivation of vineyards. Her southwest portion was mountainous, and her long southern shores held white beaches and grey shingles. Hiarostar, the southeast promontory, was most iconic for its white beaches, which were divided by the mouths of the Cyril River. On the Cyril River estuary was the large fishing town of Nindamos. Hiarostar was also famous for her trees that provided much of the wood used for Númenórean shipping. The final and easternmost promontory of Numenor was Orostar, which resembled a rough rectangular block stretching out some 200 miles, surrounded by sea on all but her western side. She was colder in climate than her 4 sisters, her northern reaches hilly and frigid, but her inland territories consisted of fertile farmlands that grew much of Numenor's grain. Within the central part of Numenor was a pastoral region known as Mittelmar. Rising up from the center of this region was a single tall and holy mountain called Meneltama, the Pillar of Heaven. Atop it was a hallowed temple dedicated to Eru Ilúvatar, where only the kings of Numenor could speak, and all others had to remain silent. The Númenóreans had a tradition of bringing the first fruits of the yearly harvest to the temple as an offering to Eru Ilúvatar. The two main rivers of Númenor and their springs flowed through this region, with the Nanduini flowing westwards and the Cyril flowing south. The eastern part of Mittelmar held the most important region of the entire island, the King's Land of Arendor. Here the royal city of Armenelos was built, alongside the eastern port of Romena, Noirinen, and the Valley of the Tombs. Along her western shores, at the mouth of the river Nanduini, lay the haven of Elder Londi. Around it was the region of Nissimaldar, the only place where the fragrant trees brought over from Tol Eressëa grew. In the east, in the long narrow bay of Romena, was a small island called Tol Uinen, which had been placed there by the Maya Uinen, the Lady of the Seas. There the devotees of Uinen, known as the Uinendili, formed the Guild of Venturers. After the War of Wrath, the Valar gave the sons of Eärendil a choice. They could be counted amongst the kindred of elves or men. Elrond chose elven immortality, while Elros chose to accept the gift of men. Out of respect for Elros's choice, the Valar blessed him with a longer lifespan than any other mortal man. Thus Elros became Tar Minyatur, the first king of Númenor. In SA32, he followed the Star of Eärendil to Númenor, bringing a fleet of 150 vessels bearing 5,000 to 10,000 Edain upon her shores. Henceforth, the settlers of Númenor became known as Númenóreans. They were also accompanied by Druidine refugees who had dwelt at the mouths of the Sirion. The majority of the Edain gradually migrated to Númenor over the course of 50 years. Over this migration period, perhaps 200,000 to 350,000 Edain sailed to the island. Over thousands of years, the Númenórean population could have reached a peak of as high as 15 million. Those of the House of Hador settled mostly on the island. Those of the House Beor settled mostly in the northwest. And the few surviving members of the House of Halith settled on the island alongside the Druidine. Alongside the gift of peace that was the land of Númenor, Eonwy came to the three houses of the Edain with three more gifts: wisdom, power, and long life. Prior to sailing for Númenor, the Edain had learned swiftly under the Eldar of all the art and knowledge they could receive. Consequently, their children increased in wisdom and skill, far surpassing all other men in Middle-earth. Thus, the Edain were swift learners under Eonwy, increasing their wisdom and skill. The Númenóreans learned how to build ships and would become the greatest mariners of men, ever loving seacraft above all else. The Valar placed only one ban upon them: to never venture so far west that they could no longer see their lands, and never to step foot upon Valinor. As a byproduct of their blessing of long life, the Númenóreans became free from sickness, their women gave birth to children more easily, and they grew far taller than even the tallest of lesser men. The average height of a Númenórean was 6'4", while Elendil would reach 7'11". Most Númenóreans were descended from the House of Hadar, and were thus golden-haired, tall, blue-eyed, and fair-skinned. Those descended from the House of Beor were generally dark-haired with grey or brown eyes. The few Númenóreans descended from the House Halith were dark-haired and smaller than those of the House of Beor. Dwelling in the far side of Tol Eressëa, initially speaking only the Elvish tongue, they became hardly distinguishable from the Eldar. Their numbers increased slowly, though their children were born fairer than their parents. They would become the fairest of men. It is said, alongside their fairness, their wills also became strong, so strong that they possessed at least an intuitive degree of Osanwi, the telepathic ability of Ainur and Incarnates. Some of the noble Númenóreans even held a degree of foresight on special occasions. Likewise, the Druidine population on Númenor also had a strange sort of foresight. During the reign of Tar Eldarion, the Druidine foresaw evil would come to the island. They began to emigrate back to Middle-earth, and by the fall of Númenor, none would be left on the island. Because Númenor was within sight of Tol Eressëa, part of the blessed realm of Aman, those who lived there were given a lifespan thrice longer than that of other men. This ranged from 350 to 420 years in the beginning, but would decline as Númenor fell under the shadow. Among all the races of men, the Númenóreans best understood the gift of Ilúvatar. Often in the early days, when Númenóreans felt the first signs of waning, they would voluntarily give up their spirits and die of their own free will. However, many Númenóreans began to fear death rather than accept it. For those who clung to life as long as possible, their bloodlines began to become senile and decrepit, declining in length compared to those of the royal line of Elros. The Númenóreans were a polyglot people. Over time, they would come to speak the Mannish language of Andunaik, though many of the Edain had learned the Elvish tongues of Sindarin prior to emigrating. Additionally, Númenórean nobles and other highly educated members of society learned the Elvish language Quenya. Andunaik was derived from Taliska, a Hadorian language closely related to Biorian. This language would be of great value to the Númenóreans who ventured back to Middle-earth, allowing them to understand the tongues of the middlemen. Andunaik held less prestige than the Elven languages, thus the lords and highly educated preferred Sindarin or Quenya. Gradually, as the shadow fell upon Númenor, Andunaik began to replace Elven tongues, and King Ar-Andunachor would be the first to take his name in Andunaik, forbidding anyone to speak Elven tongues in his presence. In Númenor's twilight years, Andunaik became the language of the royal court. As Númenor was an island, most of its population became fishermen. Although fish was the staple of the Númenórean diet, the promontory of Orostar provided her people with rich grain as well. The Númenóreans had a great love for equestrianism, breeding great horses that would roam the plains of Mittelmar. However, they never used these horses for war, as all of their wars were fought overseas. During these overseas wars, they bred Middle-earth horses that could be used by couriers or by light-armed archers, who were often not Númenórean but native auxiliaries. In contrast, Númenórean horses were bred for sport. Númenóreans enjoyed horseback archery as a pastime. Both men and women rode for pleasure, and riding was the chief means of travel in Númenor. Initially, most of Númenor's roads were unpaved, since most cargo was transported by sea, making carriages more or less obsolete. Númenórean horses were trained to hear and answer calls from great distances, and sometimes they could be summoned by thought alone. One of the most intriguing and bizarre cultural events in Númenor was held in Forrestar, and was known as the Great Bear Dance. It was held in autumn at Tompoli, where wild black bears performed a dance to the delight of their Númenórean friends. During these dances, as many as 50 bears could participate at any given time. Númenóreans practiced a religion dedicated to Eru Ilúvatar, for they and the Eldar knew Eru Ilúvatar was the only god, and that worship of any other was an abomination. The Númenóreans had religious ceremonies known as the Three Prayers for Eru Ilúvatar. These were Eru Kiami, the prayer to Eru, Eru Laetali, the praise of Eru, and Eru Hantali, the thanksgiving to Eru. These took place in spring, midsummer, and autumn, respectively. During these ceremonies, the king or queen wore all white garlands and ascended Mount Meneltama. There a fruit offering was made at its summit, and the king or queen performed a speech. The Númenóreans believed that only the royal line could give such speeches on Meneltama. Sometimes eagles would hover over Meneltama during these ceremonies, prompting the Númenóreans to call such an event the Witnesses of Manwë. Once Númenor came under the shadow, its people began neglecting to perform the three prayers. The last king of Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn, made ascending Meneltama punishable by death, ending the three prayers custom after 3,000 years. When Ar-Pharazôn brought Sauron to Númenor, he was seduced by him to worship Melkor. A new cylindrical temple was created near the city of Armenelos, where Melkor was worshipped via human sacrifices over great fires. This temple to Melkor was said to be around 500 feet tall and 500 feet in diameter, with walls 50 feet thick. At its top was a silver dome, where smoke was let out after burnings. Within the temple was a great altar with a black seat. Sauron sat in the seat, acting as the temple priest. The first thing that was burnt was Nimloth, the white tree that was grew from seeds of Celeborn given by the Eldar from Tol Eressëa. Nimloth was ordered cut down in SA 3262, and her wood was used to light the first flames of the fire for the worship of Melkor. The night before Nimloth was cut down, Isildur stole a fruit and planted its seeds in secret. The sacrifices were made in the hopes Melkor would lift the gift of men from the worshippers and grant the Númenóreans the immortality they craved. It is said during the destruction of Numenor, Sauron was sitting in the Black Seat, laughing to himself in glee at his success in destroying his enemy. When they first migrated to Numenor, the Edain brought with them the most knowledgeable artists and craftsmen amongst the houses of men, many of whom had learned under the Eldar. Moreover, they were often visited by the elves of Tol Eressëa, who shared their knowledge with the Númenóreans. As a result, the Númenóreans became among the most skilled weapon and armorsmiths in Arda, uncontested save for the Valar. Númenórean craftsmen developed highly advanced ironsmith techniques, producing rust-proof weapons strong enough to penetrate the hide of trolls. A guild of weaponsmiths was founded by those who learned under the Noldor, which specialized in the forging of swords, spears, axes, bows, knives, and other weaponry. The Númenóreans were masters in the mining, smelting, and forging of lead, copper, iron, and steel. They crafted spell-wrapped swords, such as the Blades of the Barrow Down, and it is also possible that they imbued spells into their indomitable masonry, as seen in works like Orthanc or the Walls of Minas Tirith. Many noble Númenóreans also inherited legendary crafts, such as the Ring of Barahir, Axe of Tuor, Bow of Bregor, and the swords Aranruth and Narsil. As a consequence of their advanced metallurgy, the army of Numenor was one of the most powerful militaries to ever exist in Arda. At the top of Numenor's military hierarchy was the King of Numenor, a title held by 25 rulers over Numenor's history, 3 of whom were queens. The rulers of Numenor held the Scepter of Numenor, which gave them executive control over the Númenórean armed forces. Underneath the king were noble families, many of whom probably held significant positions within the military hierarchy. After the royal house, the second largest noble family in Numenor were the Lords of Andúnii, who ruled over the shoreland region of Andustar and held the Scepter of Annúminas. The king held the power of decision over the affairs of state. However, there was an advisory body, the Council of the Scepter, or King's Council, which consisted of the heir of the king and lords from the 6 regions of Numenor. The Lords of Andúnii were the most prominent amongst the council. These councillors could have held positions equivalent to those of military chiefs of staff, generals and admirals, and were likely to be charged with overseeing strategic decisions at the highest levels. Numenor was a maritime power, and thus many of its commanders would have had naval backgrounds. One Númenórean sea lord we know of is Admiral Kietur, who was the commander of the Númenórean fleet sent by Tar Minastir to aid Gil-galad during the War of the Elves and Sauron in SA 1700. There was also the great Captain Eldarion, who founded the Unendili, or Guild of Venturers, a brotherhood of mariners and seamen. Petty officers in the Númenórean army were likely made up of lesser nobles and common Númenóreans who had risen through the military ranks, and were responsible for leading units at various levels. The backbone of the Númenórean military was her infantry marines, as Numenor was a maritime power, whose sphere of power was exerted along Middle-earth's coast. However, the Númenóreans utilized other unit types as well, such as specialized archers, squadrons, support units, and auxiliary cavalry. The Númenórean means of communication were maritime-based, but as the shadow fell upon Numenor, the Eldar gifted them with Amandil and the Palantiri stones that could communicate with one another over hundreds of miles of distance. One stone remained at the Tower of Avaloni, while Elendil would distribute 7 Palantiri across Middle-earth after the downfall of Numenor, allowing the later realms in exile to benefit from superior lines of communication against their enemy, Sauron. Since all of Numenor's battles were amphibious in nature, their soldiers acted as both marine and infantry. The Númenórean infantry marine was something akin to the superhuman Gurkha soldier of our world. They went to battle fully equipped, wearing heavy armor, weapons, supplies, and provisions. Each man carried a sealed wallet on his left belt, which contained a small phial of cordial and wafers of whey bread that could sustain them for many days. Númenórean whey bread was heavily influenced by Mirivori and Lembas of the Eldar. With all of this, they could march 8 leagues per day with ease, taking short breaks at the end of each league and a 1-hour break near midday. If necessary, they could push to 12 leagues a day, the equivalent of 24 to 36 miles a day. Númenórean marines wore a helmet called a kama, which was wrought of overlapping plates of metal and covered with a crest of embossed and dyed leather, giving it the appearance of a fish. We have no details on what Númenórean armor looks like, other than it being heavy, but given the Atlantean themes of Tolkien's Númenor, one could assume it was quite nautical, perhaps with a Mediterranean flair. Artist Turner Mohan drew a series of designs on early to late Second Age Númenórean armor, utilizing the Kama's design for inspiration. The Númenóreans' cleverly wrought and magnificently decorated equipment held heavy influence from the Noldor. The infantry marine weaponry was swords, axes, spears, daggers, and bows. Their weaponry was light, rust-proof, strong, and glittered in the sun. Their main weapons were spears, swords, and shields, as a result of their incredible height. It is said that they towered above the tallest orcs, and their swords and spears far outreached the weapons of their enemies. For close-range combat, Númenórean marines wielded a short sword called an eket, worn as a sidearm and described as a stabbing sword with a broad blade, pointed and two-edged, from a foot to 1.5 feet long. The infantry marines fought in phalanx formations, and when on the defensive, used a formation known as the Thangale, forming two closely pressed ranks forming a barrier of shields. The Thangale was designed to be flexible, so that it could bend at one or both of its ends to prevent flanking maneuvers, and even curl around to meet itself and form an unbroken circle of shields. This was akin to the ancient Greek phalanx, Scottish sheltron, and ancient Roman testudo. They also used an offensive formation known as the Dernaeth. This was a wedge formation launched over a short distance against an enemy that was massing but not yet arranged. It was designed for rapid attacks to disorganize the enemy and relied on the Númenóreans' superior size and strength. However, while the Númenóreans were capable of overwhelming their enemies with their size and strength in close quarters, it was actually from a distance they were most feared. Indeed, the Númenóreans had a specialized ranged unit, known as the King's Archers, whose cohorts bore bows created from hollow steel, that fired 4-foot-long black-feathered arrows. The bows of the Númenóreans were greatly feared, for it was said that in battle, the men of the sea send before them a great cloud, as a rain turned to serpents, or a black hail tipped with steel. Númenórean men, being tall and powerful, were capable of shooting longbows with massive drawwings, with speed and accuracy over a distance of some 600 yards. Númenórean archers used both longbows and smaller bows, the latter being used mainly while shooting from horseback. They also utilized crossbows, though mainly against predatory birds. Beyond archery, horsemanship, and metallurgy, the greatest love of the Númenóreans was by far the Great Blue Sea. Númenórean ships were known to have up to 5 masts. While most of their ships were primarily sail-powered, others also had oars. Once under the shadow, some of Númenor's galleys were rowed by slaves. In early notes, Tolkien stated that the Númenórean navy was made up of ships that go without the wind, and ships that were made of metal that sheareth hidden rocks, sinking not in calm or storm. Tolkien also wrote about Númenórean ships that sail in the air of breath, suggesting airships, but he disregarded these ideas later. While it seems unlikely that Númenor had any steam or airships, they could have ironclad their boats, giving them a level of naval technology equivalent to the Industrial Revolution. There were many famous Númenórean ships, such as Entellesi, sailed by the great Númenórean mariner Fiantur during the time of Tar Elendil. In SA 600, Entellesi was the first Númenórean ship to journey back to Middle-earth when she sailed to the Grey Havens. The golden-sailed vessel of Númenórean was the first ship Aldarion sailed, upon which he explored Lindon, Eriador, the Bay of Belfalas, and most of the coasts of Middle-earth between SA 725 and 727. After Númenórean, Aldarion built Iambar as a dwelling place for his Guildhouse of the Venturers. It was a massive ship, anchored originally off Tol Uinen, but later moved to the port of Andúniu. Next, Aldarion built Hirilondi, known as the Haven Finder, in the shipyards of Ravenna. Onlookers marvelled at her tremendous size, and many referred to her as the Wooden Whale. Aldarion first sailed the Hirilondi in SA 877 to explore Middle-earth for 5 years. The Númenóreans held a custom that when one of their ships set sail, a Númenórean woman, typically a relative of the captain, would place a branch of Orioleri upon her prow. This was known as the Green Bough of Return. It was a token of friendship with Ossi and Uinen, and a symbol of good fortune. However, when it was time to bring Orioleri to Aldarian's greatest ship, the Palaran, Aldarian's father, Tar-Meneldur, forbade the queen and Aldarian's sister from doing so. The Orioleri was instead brought by Erendis, causing the prince to fall in love with her. When Aldarian became king of Numenor and departed for Middle-earth again in SA 883, his then-wife Erendis had become estranged from him because of his frequent voyaging. To show her anger, she refused to bring the Orioleri, and instead placed an image of an eagle with a golden beak and jeweled eyes on the prow of Aldarian's ship. This had been a gift given to him by Círdan. Yet by far, the most formidable ship Numenor ever produced was Alcarandas, known as the Castle of the Sea. She was the gold and black flagship of Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Numenor. She had numerous masts, many oars, and golden sable sails. The realm of Numenor began in SA 32, when Elros took the title Tar-Miniatur, meaning first power, at the age of 90. He began the tradition of taking his kingly title in Quenya, as it was considered the noblest language. Under his reign, Numenor established a close friendship with the Eldar of Tol Eressëa. The elves came to Numenor on white ships, bearing gifts such as flowers, healing herbs, birds, and a seedling of Celeborn that grew into the White Tree of Nimloth. Elros ruled for 410 years, the longest of any Numenorian king. Under his rule, the citadel and tower in Armenelos were built, but when he reached the age of 500, he felt the wane and willingly laid down his life in SA 442. After Elros's death, the scepter of Numenor was inherited by the oldest of his 4 children, Vardamir. Instead of a crown, the kings and queens of Numenor took this scepter as the primary symbol of their royal authority. The scepter was typically surrendered voluntarily to the heir among the early kings, but that tradition would be broken under the shadow. Beyond the royal scepter, there was also the Silver Scepter of Andúnië, which was created for the Lord of Andúnië, who ruled the shoreland region of Andustar. The Scepter of Andúnië survived the fall of Numenor, after which it became known as the Scepter of Annúminas. After inheriting the throne from his father, Vardamir took the title Nolimon, meaning Learned One, for his chief love was the ancient lore of elves and men. Because of Tar-Miniatur's incredibly long life, Nolimon only received the scepter when he was already 381 years of age. He reigned as king only a single year, before passing the scepter to his eldest son, Amandil. In doing so, Vardamir established a new custom for the kings of Numenor, who chose to pass on the scepter out of their own free will, while still being of good health and mind. Tar-Amandil, meaning lover of a man, ruled for 148 years as the 3rd king of Numenor. He gave up the scepter in SA 590 after handing it to his eldest son, Elendil. Tar-Elendil, meaning elf friend, ruled for 150 years. He was also nicknamed Parmeiti, for he wrote numerous books citing the vast lore collected by his grandfather, Nolimon. Tar-Elendil married late in life, and his eldest child was a daughter named Silmarion. It was during Tar-Elendil's reign in SA 600 that Fiantor, captain of the king's ships, set sail upon Entellesi for the Grey Havens and established an alliance with Gil-galad. These were dark years for the men who resided in Middle-earth, many of whom had been forced into servitude under Sauron. Hearing word of the landing of the Númenóreans, the middlemen of Eriador came to meet them at Tower Hills. The Númenóreans taught the middlemen many things, which they subsequently used to rise up against Sauron. Soon the middlemen began to revere the Númenóreans, with some even calling them gods. Tar-Elendil had 3 children, 2 daughters named Silmarion and Isilmi, and a son named Iramon. Because the custom was to pass the scepter to the eldest son, Tar-Elendil passed it to Iramon, who became Tar-Meneldur. Despite this, his eldest daughter, Silmarion, became a famous figure in her own right, as Tar-Elendil gave her the Ring of Barahir and made her son, Valindir, the first Lord of Andúnië. The Lords of Andúnië became esteemed members of the Council of the Scepter, comprised of nobles and lords from the 6 regions of Numenor who advised the king. Whenever an heir to the throne was named, they would join the council to learn about governance. The Lords of Andúnië were the most prominent of the chief councillors. When Numenor fell deep under the shadow, the Lords of Andúnië remained faithful to the Valar and covertly aided other faithful. Using the Council of Scepters, the Lords of Andúni attempted to dissuade the kings of Númenor from evil actions. King Tarmeneldur, whose name meant Servant of the Heavens, ruled from SA 740 to 883. During his reign, many journeys to Middle-earth were made, first by Viantor, then by Tarmeneldur's son, Anardil. Anardil became known as Aldarion, and greatly expanded upon Númenor's exploration of Middle-earth's coasts. In SA 725, Viantor took Aldarion to Middle-earth for the first time, despite Meneldur's reluctance to the idea. They sailed upon New Miramar, visiting the Grey Havens, Lindon and West Eriador, where they established a friendship with Gil-galad and Círdan. Thus began Aldarion's love of sea voyaging, an occupation which displeased his loved ones. His endless oceanic escapades also prompted the Druidine to begin emigrating back to Middle-earth, for the strange foresight they possessed told them that evil would soon come. Aldarion ventured onto the seas again between SA 730 and 735, exploring past the mouths of the rivers Isen, Gwathlo and Berenduin, circling the Cape of Ras Morthael and the Bay of Belfalas. In SA 750, Aldarion founded the Guild of Venturers, a brotherhood of mariners. They would have no fixed guildhouse on land, and instead built a ship, Iambar, for this purpose. Aldarion and his venturers visited Gil-galad in Lindon and explored much of Middle-earth's southern coasts. King Tarmeneldur was greatly displeased that his heir, Aldarion, was constantly taking to the sea, concerned that Aldarion was increasing the Númenorian people's desire for dominion over other lands. He attempted to curb his son's seafaring by prohibiting the cutting of trees for shipbuilding. However, Aldarion circumvented this restriction by establishing the haven of Vignolondi at the mouth of the River Gwathlo, from where he could continue to cut down trees to build ships. Vignolondi became the first permanent settlement of the Númenorians in Middle-earth, and one of its primary shipyards. Unfortunately, within a few centuries, deforestation occurred in Enedwaith and Minhiriath, angering the local forest folk. These people were numerous and warlike, living in scattered communities within the forests. They began plundering Vignolondi, but when Aldarion voyaged in the area between SA 863 and 869, the forest folk were fearful of him and did not confront him directly. The forest folk also began a rumour of a lord in Middle-earth who hated the Númenorians. In SA 800, Tarmeneldur commanded Aldarion to cease his voyaging. Despite this, Aldarion persuaded his father to agree after 6 years to let him voyage again. During the voyage in SA 806, Aldarion returned with a shipload of gold and silver. It was also around this time that Aldarion fell in love with Erindis, a love which would only be rivaled by his love for the sea. When he returned, Tarmeneldur forbade him from leaving again, but he did so in defiance of his father. Between SA 816 and 820, Aldarion voyaged out once more, and returned with gifts for his mother, the ladies of her house, and his Erindis, to whom he bequeathed diamonds. Between SA 824 and 829, he set sail from his homeland once more, and returned with 9 ships carrying timber and 2 newly built ships from Vignolondi. In SA 877 to 882, Aldarion voyaged upon Hirilondi and returned to Númenor bearing a letter from Gil-galad to Tarmeneldur. The letter held a warning that a new shadow was rising in the east, and that Gil-galad sought help from Númenor to defend Eriador against an expected assault. Tarmeneldur then realized his son had aided the Eldar, and knew much about matters involving this shadow in the east. Tarmeneldur recognized his son was better equipped than he to handle the situation. Thus he handed over the scepter in SA 883, 59 years before his death. Tar Aldarion continued voyaging for 18 years after becoming king. He travelled on both land and sea, sailing up the River Gwathlo and meeting Galadriel at Tharbad. Due to his being constantly away from home, Tar Aldarion's marriage to Erindis was greatly strained, and they only had one child, a single daughter named Ancalimi. Because he had no sons, Tar Aldarion changed the law of succession. The old law had not been a written law, it was merely an inherited custom, stating the king should surrender the scepter to his eldest son when he became too old to rule. If the king had no sons, he would pass the scepter to his nearest male relative. This would have meant Tar Aldarion's nephew, Saronto, would have taken the scepter. However, Tar Aldarian's new law changed the succession so that while the eldest son of the king was still the first in line, if the king had no sons, his eldest daughter would be offered the heirship. If the eldest daughter refused, then the king's nearest kinsman, either male or female, would become king. If the eldest daughter of the king accepted the scepter, she would have to resign if she remained unwed for a long period of time. The final stipulation in Tar Aldarian's new law was that the king's heir had to be wed within the line of Elros. Tar Aldarian abdicated in SA 1075, making Tar Ankhelami the first queen of Numenor. Tar Ankhelami ruled for 205 years, the second longest reign in Numenorean history. As a young girl, Ankhelami, meaning brightest, departed from the royal capital of Armenelos with her mother, Erindis, and servant Zamin to the White House of Erindis in the Emery region of Mittelmar. This house was a gift built for Erindis by Tar Meneldur and a sanctuary for pastures. There, Ankhelami was educated by her mother in the Elven languages, so she could read the scrolls of ancient history. Ankhelami shared traits from both of her parents. From her father, she became resolute and abstained from politics, while from her mother, she inherited a dislike towards men and marriage. She was only 19 years of age when she was proclaimed the king's heir. She immediately fled into the countryside, hiding from the many suitors who had lined up to compete for her hand in marriage following the announcement. There she acquired the title Emerwen Arenel, meaning Princess Shepherdess. In SA 1000 she married Halakar of the line of Elros, if only to thwart her cousin Saronto from becoming king. She became queen in SA 1075 and neglected the policies of her father, such as providing help to Gil-galad. In SA 1280, she surrendered the scepter to her son Tar Anarion before dying in SA 1285. Little is written about the rule of Tar Anarion, whose title meant Son of the Sun. What is known is that his two eldest daughters refused the scepter and feared their grandmother Ankhelami. Thus, after Tar Anarion, the kingship of Numenor fell to his son Tar-Surian, meaning Wind Son. Tar-Surian ruled for 162 years, dominated by the female side of the royal line. His eldest child was a female who would take the scepter after him. During his reign, the Rings of Power were forged. Tar-Pelperion, meaning Silver Daughter, became the second queen of Numenor, and presided over a highly tumultuous period of Numenorean history. Sauron had forged the One Ring, with which he planned to control the elves of Middle-earth. Sauron managed to deceive the great elven smith Celebrimbor into forging the Rings of Power, but unbeknownst to him, Celebrimbor had forged the Three Rings in secrecy in SA 1590. In SA 1600, Sauron took up his One Ring, and Celebrimbor instantly understood his intentions as he raised the alarm. Losing the element of surprise, Sauron resolved to destroy his enemies through force, preemptively attacking them before they could unify, initiating the War of Elves and Sauron. In SA 1695, Gil-galad dispatched an army led by Elrond to aid Eregion and sent word to Numenor requesting aid. Tar-Minister, the heir to Tar-Pelperion, dispatched the Numenorean fleet, commanded by Kieta. Kieta divided his fleet, sending the bulk directly to Lindon. Meanwhile, Sauron deployed a great host to invade Eregion. In response, Celeborn led a sortie out, defeating Sauron's vanguard. However, soon after, Sauron's main force pushed Celeborn's army to Ostinethil, where they were joined by Elrond's army. In SA 1697, Ostinethil fell as Celebrimbor led a desperate defence on the steps of the House of the Mirdain. Elrond and Celeborn's forces were dislodged from Eregion as Sauron captured Celebrimbor, sacked the House of the Mirdain, and seized the Nine Rings. Sauron tortured, interrogated, and executed Celebrimbor, hanging his body on a pole and having it shot through with orc arrows. Sauron then turned his forces upon Elrond's army, but Durin the Third's army sortied out of Khazad-dûm, attacking his rear while aided by a force of Galadrim led by Amroth. Elrond was saved, fleeing northwards to establish the realm of Imladris as Sauron drove the Dwarves and Galadrim back into Khazad-dûm before laying waste to Eregion. Seeking the Three Rings of Power, Sauron then turned towards Lindon, leaving a strong detachment to besiege Imladris to protect his rear. In SA 700, Sauron's forces pushed Gil-galad's army to the rivers Lune and Mithlon. Sauron then summoned additional forces from the southeast to attack the Grey Havens, but then Cieta's main force landed in the north, and alongside the forces of Gil-galad, they defeated Sauron at the River Lune. Sauron suffered many casualties as he retreated to Sarn Ford, where he suffered another terrible defeat. After this, Sauron headed southeast to link up with the reinforcements at Tharbad. However, Cieta thwarted this maneuver when he amphibiously assaulted Long Dare, attacking Sauron from the rear, while the main Númenórean and Eldar forces attacked from the north. Sauron's army was completely routed, and he himself barely managed to escape the carnage. After this, the Dark Lord's forces fled and were assailed all the way to Dagorlad, where they were finally broken, forcing Sauron to flee back to Mordor in humiliation. Thus, Eriador was saved. Thereafter, Gil-galad then rushed to Imladris and, together with Elrond, annihilated its besiegers. Sauron would never forget the dramatic intrusion of the men of Númenor who foiled his plans. Henceforth, Sauron became determined to take vengeance upon Númenor. A White Council was held among the Elf Lords and Captains of Númenor. It was determined Imladris would replace Eregion as an eastern stronghold. Gil-galad appointed Elrond vice-regent over Eriador, and gave him Vilya to build up Imladris into a stronghold that would survive many ages. Thus the Númenóreans got their first taste of power in Middle-earth, and became more invested in it. Beginning in SA 1800, the Númenóreans would begin establishing more permanent settlements on the western coast, keeping Sauron in check. Tar-Minister, meaning Tower Watcher, took the scepter from his aunt in SA 1731. He had gained a lot of experience during the war with Sauron, and would be regarded as one of the last good kings of Númenor. He took his name because he built a high tower atop Oromet in the vain hope of gazing upon Tol Eressëa. Under his reign, the Númenóreans began to yearn for the far west, though none openly spoke about it. When Sauron learned that the Númenóreans were colonizing Middle-earth, he became furious. Sauron feared them, believing they would soon steal his lands. Sauron dared not challenge the Númenóreans. Instead, he expanded eastwards, withdrawing from all of the coasts, waiting patiently for the shadow which would soon engulf the land of Númenor. It is said Tar-Ciatan, whose name meant shipbuilder, had to coerce his father into surrendering the royal scepter in SA 1869. He repudiated his father's ambitions to find the undying lands of the west, and instead focused his ambitions on Middle-earth. In his greed, Tar-Ciatan built a great fleet that sailed to the land of the Middlemen, bringing back hordes of great gems and metals. Under his reign, the Númenóreans began to oppress the lesser men who had once revered them as gods, and began speaking openly of their contempt for the Ban of the Valar, expressed their desire to sail to Tol Eressëa and Aman, and began questioning the gift of men. These ill tidings were considered the first signs of the coming of a shadow over Númenor. Even now, the corruption of Morgoth was still alive and well in Arda, working its way through the land's inhabitants. Like his father, Tar-Ciatan was greedy, and when he was the king, Númenor exacted heavy tributes upon the lesser men of Middle-earth's coasts, as the Númenórean colonies in the region slowly became fortresses that forced local men into service as their subjects. During the reign of Tar-Ciatan, the Númenóreans spoke more openly and often against the Ban of the Valar, and their covetousness of elven immortality began burning hotter. The Númenóreans now divided themselves into two groups: those who shared the feelings of the king, known titularly as the King's Men, and those who remained faithful to the Valar and continued to welcome the elves of Tol Eressëa. These folk were known as the Faithful, and gradually they migrated away from the western parts of Númenor, where the King's Men were more numerous. The Faithful were most prominent in Andúni, whose lords were of the line of Elros, descended through Silmarion. The lords of Andúni would remain on the Council of Scepters, covertly trying to dissuade kings of Númenor from evil acts and aiding the faithful whenever possible. The elves who came to Númenor during this time heard rumours about the King's Men, and were saddened at how far their once friends had fallen. Some of these elves brought word of what was happening on the star-shaped isle to the Valar. Upon hearing the tidings, Manwë grew deeply concerned, and dispatched messengers to Númenor, explaining if they came to Aman, it would only spell doom for them. He further explained why the gift of men was so great, for the elves knew not where men went when they died. Furthermore, Manwë stressed that the men of Numenor should take great care, for the shadow of old that they had once all fought valiantly against had returned. Indeed, it was around this time that the Nazgul appeared in Middle-earth. When the Nazgul rose, Sauron's dominance over men became greater. Emboldened, he even began assailing Numenorean settlements in Middle-earth. Tar-Kiatan was succeeded by his son Tar-Atanamir, whose title meant Man-Jewel, though many called him the Unwilling, for during the twilight of his reign, he refused to give up his life and the scepter to his heir, even as he grew old and witless. Tar-Ankh-Kalaemon, whose title meant Brightest, took the scepter in SA 2221. Much like his father, he opposed the ban of the Valar and the Faithful, furthering the growing social divide in Numenor. By now, many of the king's men had begun to forsake the use of elven languages and refused to teach them to their children. Despite this, Tar-Ankh-Kalaemon took his title in Quenya, fearing if the tradition was broken, ill things would be brought down upon Numenor. During his reign, the king's men built a great fortress in Umbar and colonized deeper into the southern parts of Middle-earth. The Faithful did not partake in this. Instead, they focused on the northwestern parts of Middle-earth and visited the lands of Gil-galad. There they founded a great haven called Pelargir, where many Faithful emigrated. It was also during this time that the custom of the three prayers was nearly abandoned, as the king's men focused more on their tombs, so much so that it is said the mausoleums of their royal ancestors rivaled their homes in grandeur. Next to rule was Tar-Telemaite, whose title meant silver-handed. His title referred to his love of silver and his habit of constantly sending his servants out to hunt for mithril. From his reign onwards, the kings of Numenor ruled until their death, often becoming senile and witless instead of stepping aside to allow their heirs and councillors to rule on their behalf. During Tar-Telemaite's reign, the lives of Elros's line began to wane as they obsessed over their mortality and became angry against the Valar. Tar-Telemaite ruled for 88 years, dying in SA 2825 and handing the scepter to his eldest daughter. Tar-Vanemelde, whose title meant Elven Fair, became Numenor's third queen, reigning for 111 years. She cared little for matters of state, instead occupying her days with dancing and music. Thus, the true power of the scepter fell upon her husband, Herukalmo. When the queen died in SA 2637 and her son Alcarin was poised to take the scepter, Herukalmo refused to give it up. Despite having no legal claim to the scepter, he declared himself king and took the title of Tar-Andukal, meaning Light of the West. Tar-Andukal ruled for 20 years, until his death in SA 2657. To this day, Tar-Andukal is still considered an illegitimate usurper, and is not counted in the line of kings of Numenor. Tar-Andukal was succeeded by Tar-Kalmakil, whose name meant Sword of Light. Tar-Kalmakil was young when he took the scepter. During his youth, he had been a great captain who helped colonize the coasts of Middle-earth. Sauron responded to Tar-Kalmakil's ascension to the throne with alarm, withdrawing his forces further from the coasts and retreating to the east. During his reign, it became more and more popular for the king's men to refer to their monarch by his Andanaich title. Thus, Tar-Kalmakil was not known to them as Tar-Kalmakil, but as Ar-Belzagar. In SA 2825, Tar-Ardamin, meaning World Tower, took the scepter. He was also known by his Andanaich title of Ar-Batarik. Very little is known of his 74 years of rule. He died in SA 2899, handing the scepter to his son Ar-Andunukor. At this point, most of the Numenorian population had stopped using Elven languages. Ar-Andunukor, meaning Lord of the West, would be the first king of Numenor to break the tradition of taking their title in Quenya. Despite this, he was still given the Quenya name of Tar-Herunumen in the Scroll of Kings, for he feared that completely breaking the tradition would deliver evil onto Numenor. His Andanaich title was considered blasphemous and ill-omened by the faithful, because Manwë was the Lord of the West. During his reign, the Elven language was not used or taught, though the faithful maintained it in secrecy. From then on, the elves of Tol Eressëa seldom visited Numenor, and if they did, it was in secret, and only in the presence of the faithful. Like many of his predecessors, Ar-Andunukor implemented oppressive policies to suppress the faithful. In SA 2962, Ar-Zimrathon, whose regnal name meant collector of jewels, took the scepter and continued his father's tradition of taking an Andunaic title. However, in the Scroll of Kings, his title was inscribed Tar-Hostamir. He was Numenor's 21st king, reigning for 71 years until his death in SA 3033, whereupon the scepter went to Ar-Sakulthor, meaning Sure Son. Ar-Sakulthor's name was inscribed in the Scroll of Kings as Tar-Phalasian. He ruled a year less than his father did, dying in SA 3102. Ar-Sakulthor was succeeded by Ar-Gimmelzor, whose title meant Star Foam, and who was inscribed in the Scroll of Kings as Tar-Telemnar. Ar-Gimmelzor brought a reign that was the most anti-faithful to date. He disallowed all elven speech and forbade the Eldar of Tol Eressëa from visiting, believing they were spies of the Valar. Whenever elves were caught on his shores, he punished the faithful who had allowed them to visit in secrecy. Manwë watched what was happening in Numenor with anger and despair. Manwë had tried to reach the men of the Star Isle with his advice, but they had spurned his counsel. Thus he could no longer protect them. From that point onwards, Tol Eressëa no longer sent ships to Numenor. Ar-Gimmelzor became the first king never to ascend Meneltama, and allowed Nimloth to decline. He gradually began exiling members of the faithful to the eastern parts of Numenor, near the haven of Ramenna, where they were kept under heavy surveillance. Because of this, many faithful began emigrating to the northern shores of Middle-earth. Ironically, Ar-Gimmelzor's queen, Inzilbeth, was unbeknownst to the king a member of the faithful. Inzilbeth was a descendant of Tar-Kelmekil and sister to Eärendil, the 15th Lord of Andúni. Inzilbeth managed to press her beliefs upon their eldest son, Inziledun, but the younger son, Gimilcad, remained as dogmatic as his father. Later on, when Ar-Gimmelzor figured out Inzilbeth was of the faithful, their marriage soured. Ar-Gimmelzor would have preferred that his second son, Gimilcad, receive the scepter, but the eldest, Inziledun, received it by law. Inziledun took the scepter in SA 3177, and restored the ancient tradition of taking a Quenya title, Tar-Palantir, which meant far-sighted. Tar-Palantir's reign was faced with many challenges. Numenor had fallen deeper under the shadow since the time of Tar-Atanamir. She had also grown vastly richer and more powerful, but her population now lived in fear and contempt of the mannish blessing of mortality, and thus the joy of their lives lessened. Tar-Palantir repented much of the ways of his predecessors, trying to re-establish friendship with the Eldar and Valar. He stopped the persecution of the faithful, made sure Nimloth was tended to properly, and ascended Meneltama for the three prayers. He also spent a lot of time in Andúnië amongst his mother's kin, ascending Tar Minastir to see if any ships were coming from Tol Eressëa. He could not see Tol Eressëa, and no ships came, for despite the fact that Tar-Palantir was a member of the faithful, the majority of Numenor were still king's men who scorned the Valar. During the latter part of Tar-Palantir's rule, a civil war erupted in Numenor when the king's brother Gimilcad led the king's men to resist his will. Though no violence came about openly, it lurked about in secrecy. Gimilcad died before turning 200, yet this did not bring peace, for Gimilcad's son, Pharazôn, took up his father's mantle. Pharazôn was more power-hungry than his father, and proved himself a great captain upon the sea and land, fighting wars in Middle-earth against the lesser men to extend Numenor's empire. When he returned to Numenor, his father was dead, and he began using his great wealth to win the populace's hearts. By the twilight of his reign, Tar-Palantir began to feel the wane of his years and grief for Numenor and her people. Tar-Palantir had married late in life, and only had one child, a daughter named Míriel. According to the new law of succession, Míriel was the heir apparent. However, upon Tar-Palantir's death, her cousin Pharazôn forced her to marry him against her will and seized the scepter. This was against a Númenórean law which prohibited first cousins from marriage. After seizing the throne, Pharazôn afterwards changed his wife's name to Ar-Zimrafel, meaning Jewel Daughter. Ar-Pharazôn, whose title meant Golden, took the scepter in SA 3255 and became the 25th and last king of Numenor. Ar-Pharazôn was the mightiest and most prideful king Numenor would ever see. As he sat upon the throne in Ar-Menelaos, he brooded in thoughts of war. Early in his reign, Ar-Pharazôn received reports about recent developments regarding Sauron. Sauron had begun assailing Numenorean settlements in Middle-earth since Ar-Pharazôn's return to Numenor. Moreover, the Dark Lord had assumed the titles of King of Kings, King of Men, Lord of the Earth, and Lord of the World. Ar-Pharazôn was outraged by these reports, but a certain joy came to his heart upon hearing them as well, for he sought power unbounded and the sole dominion of his will over everything. Thus he resolved to achieve this sole dominion by defeating Sauron and forcing him to be his servant and acknowledge him as the King of Men. Thus Ar-Pharazôn ordered the Numenoreans to build a grand fleet and forge a great hoard of weapons over 5 years. In SA 3261, Ar-Pharazôn sailed with his newly constructed fleet for Umbar. It is said that, at the sight of his ships, the lesser men were all afraid. Ar-Pharazôn disembarked with the army, and they began a march upon Mordor. The might of the Numenoreans terrified Sauron's servants, who began to desert him en masse. Ar-Pharazôn climbed atop a hill and sat upon a throne, dispatching heralds to call Sauron forth as he waited. Sauron realized he could not match the military strength of Numenor, so he took on his fair form, and came humbling himself before Ar-Pharazôn. Sauron smoothed Ar-Pharazôn over, complimenting him as a fair and wise ruler. Pharazôn then took away all the titles Sauron had claimed, and took him into captivity as a prized hostage to be brought back to Numenor. Sauron agreed to be constrained and came to Numenor, pretending the situation dismayed him. Yet Ar-Pharazôn was deceived, for all this was naught but Sauron's plan to destroy Numenor from the inside. When Sauron saw the land of Numenor and the great city of Ar-Menelaos for the first time, his hatred for the Numenorean people burned even brighter. Sauron quickly won the hearts of the Numenoreans, teaching them many things, and making speeches against the Valar, who he knew the Numenoreans feared and disliked. 3 years went by, during which time Sauron became known to the Numenoreans as Ziggor the Wizard, one of the king's chief counselors. Sauron used flattery to rise ever higher in the court of Ar-Pharazôn, for the king's pride was easily exploited. Only Amandil, Lord of Andúni, did not trust the words of Sauron. Terrible changes began to come over Numenor. The faithful became afraid, and many began fleeing for Middle-earth. Those who stayed watched as Sauron stirred arguments against the Valar. Sauron began telling Ar-Pharazôn that there were lands west of Numenor waiting to be conquered, but even if the Numenoreans conquered all of those lands, an ancient darkness remained beyond. Sauron explained, "And out that darkness the world was made, for darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end." To this Ar-Pharazôn asked who this Lord of Darkness was, and Sauron answered, "It is he whose name is not now spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom, and his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they." Thus Ar-Pharazôn was seduced to the worship of Melkor, at first secretly, but gradually openly in the face of his people. Thereafter, his people began to follow his lead, with only the faithful remaining as the last bastion against the darkness in Numenor. During these dark times, the faithful lived primarily in the city of Ramenna, and were led by Amandil and his son Elendil. Elendil had 2 sons, Anarion and Isildur. Both Amandil and Elendil were great captains from the line of Elros. Despite being of the faithful, Amandil remained on the Council of the Scepter as the Lord of Andúni until Ar-Pharazôn stripped him of the title at Sauron's bidding. After this, Amandil drew all of the faithful to him in Ramenna, fearing what might come next. Yet, so great a captain Amandil was that even Sauron and Ar-Pharazôn dared not lay hands upon him. Under Sauron's influence, Ar-Pharazôn completely abandoned the sacred mountain of Meneltama, forbidding any from ascending it. Sauron also seduced Ar-Pharazôn into destroying the sacred tree of Nimloth, but Ar-Pharazôn resisted at first, Fearing the words of his predecessor, Tar-Palantir, who once said that when the White Tree was dead, so too would the line of Elros perish. When Amendil heard word that Ar-Pharazôn was planning to destroy Nimloth, he became fraught with concern. Amendil then told Elendil and his sons the tale of the two trees of Valinor, and this prompted Isildur to take action. Isildur took a disguise and snuck into the court of Armenelos, getting past its guards to Nimloth. He took a fruit from the White Tree, yet before he could get away, a guard spotted him, and they fought. Isildur received many wounds, but escaped in his disguise without anyone knowing what he had done. He came back to Ravenna, handing the fruit to Amandil before collapsing from his wounds. Amandil planted the fruit in secrecy, and it sprouted in spring. When the sprout's first leaf opened, so did Isildur's eyes as he awoke from near death, his wounds no longer troubling him. Eventually, Ar-Pharazôn gave in to Sauron and cut down Nimloth. Sauron then had the Númenóreans build a round temple atop a hill in the midst of Armenelos. This temple was 500 feet across its center, with walls rising 500 feet as well. It had a large silver dome, and within it a great altar of fire and a louver that issued great smoke. As the newly appointed high priest of this temple, Sauron had Nimloth burned as the first victim of its altar of fire. Soon humans, often the faithful, had begun to be sacrificed upon the altar. They were burned in the hope Melkor would release his worshippers from the gift of men. But such bloody offerings did not yield what the king's men sought so desperately. In fact, after the sacrifices began, death only seemed to come even sooner to them. At the founding of their kingdom, the Númenóreans understood the gift of men, and willingly laid their lives down so that they may die peacefully. Now, however, they were in misery. They had forgotten the meaning of the blessing of mortality and clung to life desperately. Performing grotesque acts, such as human sacrifice, was not preventing their deaths, but speeding them up. Where once Númenóreans knew no sickness, now they got sick and often died of illness or madness. Even more direly, Númenóreans were now even taking up weapons and slaying one another. Despite their madness, the Númenóreans were still great and terrifying. They continued to assail the lesser men of Middle-earth, pillaging them and stealing them away to Númenor for sacrifices at the Great Altar of Fire. Ar-Pharazôn had become the greatest tyrant since Morgoth, but in truth it was Sauron controlling him as a puppet. In SA 3310, Ar-Pharazôn began to feel the wane, and it terrified him. Sauron advised him that the time had finally come for his greatest plan. Ar-Pharazôn's empire had grown so great that Sauron proclaimed the time was ripe for the king to take anything he desired, even from the very Valar themselves. Thus Sauron said, "The Valar have possessed themselves of the land where there is no death, and they lie to you concerning it, hiding it as best they may, because of their avarice, and their fear lest the kings of men should wrest from them the deathless realm, and rule over the world in their stead. And though doubtless the gift of life unending is not for all, but only for such as are worthy, being men of might and pride and great lineage, yet against all justice it is done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the King of Kings, Ar-Pharazôn, mightiest of the sons of earth, to whom Manwë alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials, and take what is their due." Thus Ar-Pharazôn was deceived into setting sail against the Valar. Ar-Pharazôn ordered a great armament for this secret war against the Valar. However, Amandil soon discovered this armament. Alarmed, Amandil spoke to his son Elendil, telling him he would go west despite the ban to seek help from the Valar, just as their forefather Eärendil had once done. He would do this secretly, lest Ar-Pharazôn and Sauron punish his house for his actions. He asked Elendil to prepare ships for the faithful, so they could sail out of Ravenna harbour. Amandil took 3 servants and sailed off, first heading east, then circling west. He was never seen or heard from again. Elendil, meanwhile, followed his father's wishes, preparing the faithful for what seemed to be the ruin of Númenor. Elendil had his people board their ships with their great heirlooms. In going into Exodus, they brought the 7 Palantiri given to them by the Eldar, which were divided amongst the ships of Elendil, Isildur and Anarion. Within the ship of Isildur was a tiny scion of Nimloth, while Elendil carried the Ring of Barahir. The weather around Númenor had always suited her populace. but now it had turned foul. Terrible rains and hail fell from a darkened sky, while violent winds made sailing dangerous. Sometimes a great cloud would come from the west in the shape of an eagle, blotting out the sun as it did. Lightning could be seen under the eagle's wings, and thunder echoed when they flapped. During this time the lightning increased, and some Númenóreans were even struck and killed by it. A tremendous bolt hit the dome of Melkor's temple, breaking and setting it on fire. But the temple stood strong, as Sauron stood inside it atop a pinnacle, unhurt by the lightning. At this point, the king's men believed Sauron was a god, and did everything he commanded. The last warning the Númenóreans received from the Valar was a tremendous rumbling and shaking of the land, as smoke issued from Meneltamer. Yet they all ignored this, continuing the great armament of Ar-Pharazôn. For 9 years, the great armament had been prepared in the havens of western Númenor, while Elendil had gathered a small fleet in her east. In the west, the captains awaited aboard their ships, with banners of gold and black, their masts as dense as a forest upon the mountains. Meanwhile, Sauron went to Melkor's temple and had the king's men bring him human sacrifices to be burned. As the day fell, the Eagles of Manwë came out of the west, arraying themselves for battle. It seemed all of Númenor burned with wrath against the Valar. In SA 3319, Ar-Pharazôn gave the signal to depart. He sailed aboard his flagship, the Alcarondas, known as the Castle of the Sea. It was a terrifying black ship with golden sable sails and many masts and oars. Those in Númenor watched the Great Armada sail away from sight. The fleet was so large that it compared to the archipelago of 1,000 islands surrounding Númenor. The Eldar on Tol Eressëa saw the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn sail around them and surround the entire island on its way to Aman, and they mourned their once allies for what they had become. At long last, Ar-Pharazôn's fleet anchored off the coast of Valinor. Ar-Pharazôn saw the splendour of Taniquetil and became terrified, nearly ordering the fleet to turn. Yet his nerve held firm, and his pride carried him ashore as he set foot upon Aman, his vast army making landfall behind him. Ar-Pharazôn led the army to the elven city of Tirion and formed an encampment around it near Túna. The Eldar fled in fear of the Númenórean host, and the Valar were hopeless to defend them, for the Valar were forbidden from killing or using force against men. Thus Ar-Pharazôn proclaimed that if no one would challenge him for Aman, then he would be claiming it for his own. Terrified of what the Númenóreans would do in Valinor, Manwë called upon Eru Ilúvatar as the Valar relinquished their governance over Arda. Eru Ilúvatar set forth his power, changing Arda forever. A great chasm opened between Númenor and Aman, swallowing the fleet, Ar-Pharazôn, and all the soldiers who had dared to set foot upon Aman. They were all engulfed and buried under falling hills, their tomb becoming known as the Caves of the Forgotten. Eru Ilúvatar then pulled Aman and Tol Eressëa into the mists, as Númenor was completely covered by great waves and sank into the abyss. Sauron, who had remained in Melkor's temple, sat upon his black throne, laughing to himself at his tremendous success in bringing about the destruction of Númenor. Just as the abyss came upon him, he mulled over his ambitions to conquer all of Middle-earth, a goal which, with Númenor out of the picture, was now more possible than ever. With Eru Ilúvatar's intervention, the flat surface of Arda bent back upon itself. Aman and Tol Eressëa were no longer of Arda, and only the elves could find their way back to them through the strait. Eru Ilúvatar created new lands in the west, and empty lands to the east of Middle-earth. From that point onwards, men who sailed west of the Great Sea would find no barrier, and instead circumnavigate the world. Arda had diminished. Although Sauron was triumphant, he had made one critical mistake. The Dark Lord had infused part of his power into the One Ring. In doing so, Sauron had anchored himself to something, making the same mistake as Melkor once had. When Melkor infused most of his power into Arda, he diminished and became trapped in the incarnate form of Morgoth. His disciple ultimately suffered a similar fate. Although Sauron's physical body survived the destruction of Númenor, he too was diminished, losing the ability to take on his fair form. Just as Melkor was made captive to Arda, Sauron became captive to the One Ring. His spirit travelled back to Mordor, now greatly weakened, and he would be slow to rebuild his physical body. His new form was the image of malice and hatred made visible. No longer able to achieve his goals through seduction and deception, he could now only rule through terror and force. The doom of Numenor was not hers alone. To destroy his hated enemy, Sauron had diminished himself, and soon his doom would come as well. While Numenor was no more, many Númenóreans, both Kingsmen and faithful, survived the cataclysm. The Kingsmen, who were in Númenórean colonies in Middle-earth during Numenor's downfall, established new realms in the south, the chief of these being Umbar. They became known as Black Númenóreans and continued to serve Sauron. Two of these Black Númenóreans, Herumor and Fuinor, would later rise to power amongst the Haradrim. In his later wars, Sauron would call upon the Black Númenóreans to fight for him. As for the faithful, it is unknown if Amandil made it to Valinor, but his line lived on. As the Great Wave rolled over Numenor, a wind came out of the west, sending Elendil's fleet towards Middle-earth. 9 ships were driven east, but their masts broke, and they could not control where they sailed. Elendil and his sons arrived in Middle-earth and settled among the faithful colonists who had already established themselves in the realms of exile generations earlier. Sauron had failed, for although these refugees were but an echo of the greatest of Numenor, the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, which descended directly from the line of Numenor, would later become his greatest enemies. The downfall of Numenor echoes the drowning of Atlantis, the Tower of Babel, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and other tales of the fall of man. Its story is connected to Tolkien's overall theme of decline and fall. For just like language, people are sundered over time. The story of the men of Numenor is a tragedy about the perils of pride, greed, and lust for power that led once the noblest peoples to their doom. Ultimately, it was the hubris of man that led to the downfall of Numenor. More videos on the works of Tolkien and the stories of Middle-earth are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.